Good evening. Thank you for being here today. We have a much smaller group of folks that here tonight. We had a 2 o'clock virtual portion of this program, and we've had about 28 to 30 people on that. So, but anyway, we'll run through this and ask your questions as we go. My name is Katie Service. I am the airport manager for Cape Cod Gateway Airport. Like I said, we had a 2 o'clock virtual meeting option today. We've done that in the past for all of our meetings. This is meeting number 5 for the environmental review. We also had a number of meetings, about 4 to 5 during the master plan process that was previous to this program. So again, Katie Service, Matt Elia, Assistant Airport Manager, and then Alyssa and your team, if you could just introduce yourselves.
Sure. Alyssa Jacobs with Epsilon Associates. We're the airport's environmental consultants. I have with me this evening Nate Rotting with Epsilon Associates, Bob Mallard with Airport Solutions Group, the airport engineer on the team, and our public outreach folks from Howard Stein Hudson are in the back of the room, Will and Taylor.
Okay, for the agenda tonight, we're going to go through the project timeline, and we've geared this presentation to go over the meeting topics based on the written comments that we received as part of the draft EA and EIR that was submitted to the MEPA office. We will also go through next steps, how you can comment on the final EIR to MEPA, and then any questions that you might have. So, going to go to the next slide here, which are meeting goals. Again, tonight's purpose is to discuss the comments that were received from the draft EA, EIR, that was received through the MEPA office. Those comments are available online. We have them posted on our website as well, but you can also go to the MEPA's office website to get those comments as well. We had 16 total written comments. We provided for a 60-day review period, which is longer than the typical review period. We typically do that. We typically extend the review period time frame. Normally it's just 30 days, but we provided 60 days. We received 4 agency comments and 12 public comments. Again, this meeting will address those specific comments. We're also going to provide project updates, give you an opportunity to ask questions after each topic is presented, and then we'll talk about how you can address any further comments that you have as part of the final EA, EIR, and how you can address those comments. What is the appropriate avenue to do that? And then, of course, we'll continue to receive input from the community in regards to this process. With that, my slides are done for now. I'm going to hand this over to Alyssa Jacobs, who will go through the vast majority of the presentation. Alyssa?
Thank you, Katie. Hold on, let me just a little taller than Katie. All right, so this evening we're going to be presenting in a topic-based format, and there'll be an opportunity for you to stand up and ask questions or provide comments after each topic at designated points during the presentation. So we just ask that you raise your hand. There's so many of you this evening, you're gonna have to duke it out. Just please raise your hand. We have a microphone, and we will come to you and state your name and ask your question. But I would want to point out that the comments and questions received tonight are not official to any state or federal agency as part of the review process. Those do need to be written comments once our documents are published and made available for review. And I'll get into how that is, you'll be able to do that and what the timeline is for that. But written comments can be submitted in many different ways, but the easiest way is via email, either directly to the state office, mepa@mass.gov, or our project email, which is on the screen. We'll have it on the screen later in the presentation. There's postcards with that information on it as well. Right, so where are we in the process, in the environmental review process? So as Katie mentioned, prior to this was the master plan process. with public meetings. The master plan was finalized and approved, and we started the environmental review process in late October 2022 with a meeting specifically designed for outreach to our environmental justice communities surrounding the airport. And then we made our first document submittal to MIPA, and we held some subsequent meetings on site that were open to the public or also virtual, as Katie mentioned. And so folks had multiple opportunities to participate and learn about the process and engage with comments and questions. So we had three meetings in 2023, and then we submitted at the end of the year the draft EA/EIR document. EA is environmental assessment, EIR is environmental impact report. Those are federal and state terminologies. I'll explain that shortly. So with that, we offered the extended comment period, and then MIPA issued what's called a certificate. It takes into consideration the public comments received, the agency comments, state and federal comments that were received, and gave us a scope of additional information that we needed to address in our final document. And so that's what we're here tonight. We're here to kind of demonstrate to you how we've addressed those comments, where the project stands now, and we will be submitting our final documentation next month. And that will be publicly noticed. It'll be available on the website. We'll be sending out emails to our stakeholders, et cetera. So that is when the actual written document will be available and when the public comment period will start. The state agency, MIPA, will issue what's called a certificate with their findings and their decision. And then subsequently, the federal agency will issue their determinations. So FAA is the federal agency in this case. And then we'll continue on with our more regional review process, the Cape Cod Commission, and then get into permitting as necessary for the projects. So we've held, so of these public meetings, 2 were considered required by the regulatory review process, and then we've held an additional 3 to provide additional opportunity for input and comments. So just a little bit of background. The state environmental review process falls under the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, MIPA. The document I'm referring to their terminology, it's an environmental impact report. You prepare a draft and then a final. So we're at the final stage. And as I mentioned, MIPA will issue a certificate documenting its findings. MIPA is not a permitting agency or a regulatory authorizing agency. It's a planning phase document review process. At the federal level, under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, we're preparing what's called an environmental assessment, a draft and a final, and we will be issuing the final environmental assessment. During the draft phase, we combine these documents. There's a lot of overlap between the 2 different regulatory requirements. But at this final stage, these are going to be 2 separate documents to address the individual regulatory review process. Primarily, FAA needs the state review process to be concluded before they can issue their determination as well. Okay, so just a little bit refresher background, and if there's anyone in the audience that hasn't been to prior meetings or aren't familiar with the proposed projects that are part of the master plan, I'm happy to back up and provide a little bit more information as may be necessary. But the master plan proposed a series of projects to be enacted over the next 20 years. And what we're looking at are projects that will be either kind of commenced via design or construction over the next 5 to 7 years in this review time frame. So the proposed projects include, let's see if I can figure out this. Nope. I had assumed it was the red button, but no. Yeah, you can have this. Oh, okay. I gotta press hard, okay. Okay, there we go. All right, taxiway B, or is located right here. So keep my hand steady. And so that basically involves a shift of the taxiway to a more standard separation distance to the runway. Taxiway D is the construction of a new parallel taxiway to this runway, and the removal of some existing stub portions that are non-standard or they don't intersect the runway at a 90-degree angle, and the addition of a aircraft run-up area. Easement acquisition at each of the 4 runway ends. This is acquisition for airspace control only. There's no proposed constructions on these easements. This is just so the airport has control over the airspace and can control the height of any buildings or trees, et cetera, as may be necessary. Those are proposed to be acquired on a willing seller basis only. And much of these easements are for existing conditions, not proposed conditions. So basically, as the airport currently exists now, these easements are required. Runway 15 will be extended by 895 feet. That's this end of the runway, and its parallel taxiway A will also be extended. We've identified some aeronautical development areas in these yellow light polygons here, and then the construction of a snow removal equipment storage building. So excuse me, a couple hours of this, I'm starting to lose my voice. The MEPA comments received refer to, as Katie noted, the public comments as well as agency review letters, in addition to the actual agency MEPA certificate itself. And then our responses, so we focused it down to these topics that were received during the 60-day comment period. If you're interested in reviewing all the comments, they're part of the MEPA certificate, available on the airport's website, MEPA's website. I can tell you how to get there if you're interested. So airport noise, groundwater aquifer protection, air quality and greenhouse gas emissions, wetland impacts, tree removal, public health and environmental justice concerns, and airport usage and location. So these are the topics. After each topic, we'll pause and take any comments or questions. So hold on 2 seconds. My computer screen went to sleep. Okay, so the first topic is noise. We put that first because that's always the most interesting topic to everyone. So the noise comments or statements. So I labeled these, if it's a C in front of the comment, that means it was a comment letter from the public. If there is an M, that means it was in the MEPA certificate or requested by a state agency in its review. So one of the comments was, noise modeling doesn't count as measuring noise. The draft EA/EIR didn't include a Part 150 study as requested, and that flight path analysis should be required by the airport as a mitigation measure. So I'm going to walk through a couple slides on the noise and our response to those comments. I'm going to look at some notes because noise is complicated. Okay, so our presentation, our documentation and analysis in the draft EA/EIR was based on what is required by FAA as part of this regulatory review process. And so we used the Aviation Environmental Design Tool model. So this is the federally approved model to model the noise. And that is what is required by a Part 150 study and complies with FAA requirements. And so this model has all the, it's very complicated. It has all the inputs. You input operational information, runway and runway information, different aircraft usage and operations by those aircraft. And that's all part, that's all input into the model and all calibrated internally in the model. And so this is used to generate average noise results. So this is not modeling the noise you hear in your backyard when an airplane flies over. This is modeling your cumulative impact and exposure to the noise. And our results, which I'll present on the next few slides, basically indicated that based on the regulatory requirements and how the noise modeling contours, they did not impact the residential property. So there's no further federal action to take relative, or further studies to take relative to noise. The airport is committed to analyzing flight takeoff procedures as suggested by one of the comments, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Oh, clicking on my laptop like that's going to work. All right, so with regards to Part 150, that terminology refers to an exact federal code of regulations that detail what is a noise compatibility study. And so a Part 150 study produces noise exposure maps, and the ones that we produced were consistent with those used, the methodology used as a Part 150 study. And they demonstrated that all the surrounding land uses meet the FAA's compatibility requirements for residential use. So basically, there's no noise contour exceedance off airport for residential use. So based on this, FAA said, this part of the process, this part of the regulatory review for the environmental assessment, you've met that requirement. The reason that noise monitoring is not done as part of this process is because noise monitoring can provide some supplemental information in various contexts, but there's a lot of various factors that would affect the data collected, and you would have to collect it at a very high number of monitoring locations for the data to be useful, and it doesn't reflect, you're not able to model different types of conditions like a model. It only evaluates one point in time. All right, so the noise metric that is used by the federal government is the day-night average sound level. So that's the DNL. And it's used to reflect your cumulative impact and exposure to noise. So over a 24-hour period, and it weighs nighttime exposure more heavily than daytime exposure as part of that model. In the model. And it's a way to describe noise in a uniform way for all airports, so that everything, all factors considered. It's a standardized method. So this is just a graphic that shows one day of events, and so you could have, for example, one or two very noisy events equivalent to multiple less noisy events. It's a cumulative exposure, and that's what the model tries to standardize. So 65 decibels is considered, all land uses are compatible. So the model produces this graphic. And so we'll zoom in a little bit, but so the 65 decibel DNL is in yellow here. And what this is modeling is the build versus the no build condition in 2040. So if the runway extension occurs, that is the build condition. The no build is if the runway extension is not built. Sure. The build condition is the runway extension. So this is what the noise is modeled in the build condition in the year 2040, so future conditions, versus the no build. There's no runway extension constructed. What does that look like? So we're able to ask and answer those questions using the model. So the airport is outlined in black, just to kind of orient you a little bit here. Lewis Bay is down at the south side of the map, and then Route 6 is up here along the north side of the map. All right, so we're going to zoom in on this area because this is the only area that when you compared the build to the no build conditions where there was any change or any difference. All right, so again, 65 DNL is the sound level, decibel sound level that is what FAA looks at for impacts. So again, that's in yellow. The solid yellow line is the model for, the change for the build condition. The kind of the yellow shading here is existing. So you do have this change, right? It shifts outward. But it stays all on airport here for the 65 DNL. We do have the small area where it does extend off airport. However, this is all commercial and industrial area, and thus it's considered a compatible land use under the regulations. It's not residential. And so therefore, the conclusion in our document is that there's no further analysis or study required under the regulations for noise. Elevation. So it takes into account the ground elevations, ground contours as well. So that could be a higher point, perhaps. No, it's all zone congestion. That's Independence Ave, Road Ave. No. Yeah, I don't. Okay, Katie.
Yeah, we will get to the questions. I have one more slide, and we'll get over to that. So basically, based on the information that Alyssa has just provided for you, we followed the federal regulations in terms of what we can model for the build versus no build scenarios to understand what are our impacts if there's any impacts associated with noise. And Alyssa had indicated that the model takes into account the aircraft that are using the facility. When we did the master plan process, we identified the existing aircraft that were operating at the airport. We also indicated what the future aircraft may be. Those future aircraft are existing aircraft, corporate type aircraft, small single engine aircraft that were included in the model. Basically everything that comes on airport was included in the model. We also took a look at changes in aircraft fleets because JetBlue is looking at getting into a different type aircraft. They're in an E190 aircraft. They're going to an A220 aircraft. That aircraft actually has already flown to the airport several times, but they're transitioning to that on a regular basis. So that was included in the model. All of that information is put into the model, and the model itself that the FAA has identifies what the noise signature is from the aircraft engines for each model of aircraft. The only time that you're not going to have an aircraft in that model is if it's a brand new aircraft that it hasn't been entered into the model at that point in time. So just to give you an example, I believe that when we did the model, the Technam, which is a newer aircraft that a few of them have been purchased by Cape Air, and they also have their Cessna 402. The Cessna 402 is a louder signature, noise signature than the Technam. The Technam aircraft wasn't available to put into the model. So we used the 402, even though we know that they have a number of Technam aircraft that are now in their fleet. So if anything, we're using an older aircraft with a higher noise signature in our overall model. So that's what we had to do because the Technam wasn't available, just to give you an example. Additionally, we were asked by the community to take a look at any modifications that we could potentially make to takeoff procedures. we were asked to look at any potential tweaks that we can make to the flight operations that occur at the airport. And we haven't, since I've been here for almost 10 years, we haven't studied that during my time here. It was looked at previously to me, but we said, sure, let's take a look at this. So what we did is we have a project management team that developed a scope of work for us that takes a look at that will take a look at our existing procedures and then look at those procedures to see if there's any modifications or tweaks that can be made. This process must include the Federal Aviation Administration because the FAA are the only ones that can make modifications to flight approaches and departures to an airport. They have to take into a lot of different things into account that maybe an airport facility isn't taking into account. We're at the end or the beginning of it for an aircraft's operation. So they're taking into account other things, such as when the aircraft departs from the airport, where is it going? Are there other obstructions that they need to be aware of? So they take all of that into account. They also take into account other airports in the area. You don't want to have, a situation where now you're impacting another airport from your operations. So all of that is taken into account. So we'll be working with the FAA on that. We have developed a project advisory committee. It's still developing. It is going to be made up of community representatives. So if any of you here want to be part of that process and come onto that PAC, please let me know. We will also have airfield tenants that will be part of that because that will affect them too, how they operate in and out of the airport. So the PAC will consist of a broad range of residential homeowners as well as users of the airfield. We will outline what our expectations are. Obviously, we're going to develop or look at potential scenarios, potential options and alternatives. We'll have to study that, but we have to, again, go to the Federal Aviation Administration and make sure that's a sound decision. Is it a sound option? Is it a sound alternative? So those are the things that we have to walk through. And I think it's a good exercise for us to do because it's an exercise, like I said, in my 10 years, we haven't done that. So let's take a look at it and do that. We have this process separate from the environmental review process because the environmental review process said that there was no further action to be taken. We met the standard, and as Alyssa just alluded to, all of the noise contour, the DNL noise contour, that average noise level, all stayed within property boundaries except for the compatible land use, which is in industrial and commercial. So this is an extra step, and that's why it's being pulled out of the environmental review process. But we hope to start this soon. We want to get through this process first. So that will be coming up next. Again, if any of you are interested, let me know. Now up for questions related to noise. So I'll ask Alyssa to get back up here again for me. And we do have a microphone. Will has a microphone. So if you do have a question, we ask that you speak into the microphone because this is being recorded and will be posted on our website. Any questions about noise?
Yes, the day-night noise level, you're saying that's an average over a 24-hour period? Is that right?
Yes.
So it doesn't measure individual noises?
Correct. We did earlier, and it was presented at an earlier outreach meeting, model what's called a single exposure levels as to for specific aircrafts taking off a certain runway end. And so we did model those to look at what that decibel reading would be predicted in the model, and just as it was to satisfy a community concern. So we did look at it in different ways. But again, the FAA requires us to look at the DNL.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, it's fine to look at the DNL, but if someone is close by and the plane goes over and they can't hear what the person right next to them is saying, then it doesn't really matter what the model says or what FAA thinks is compatible if those people feel that there's a significant impact on their life. So is there anything in the environmental assessment that you've drafted for FAA, which is, of course,
Yep.
their document, not yours? You're just drafting it for them. And is there anything in there that speaks to that as far as how the higher level, when is it
The single
become,
event.
when does a person unable to speak to another person standing right next to them?
So, again, we're tied to these regulatory requirements as to what is defined as a significant impact threshold. So in that document, as I mentioned, we've looked at it multiple different ways. Katie's going above and beyond with looking at it, from the perspective of how can operations be potentially modified to lower noise levels in that respect. But from the federal EA document, no, we've maintained that the DNL is what's required, and that's what's
No, that wasn't my question.
that there's no
Okay.
significant
That
impact.
wasn't my question.
Yeah. Well, there's
Is there
no.
anything in the document that a person can look at and say,
It's-
75 decibels, 80 decibels of a single event
from like
is
a
too
public,
high or
so,
too low?
so from like a public health consideration, yeah. There's a discussion on impacts on public health, yes, and how noise among other categories of impact to public
Does
health.
it say, though, that anything above 85 or 72 or whatever?
What that
is
consistent noise exposure would be to.
No, that is not my question. Don't, thank you for trying to finish my question, but no. Is there anything in there that speaks? We know the DNL is 65 over the average, and FAA considers that to be a significant indicator. There's no standard. That's just an indicator of what they think. There's nothing in the law that's in NEPA or anything that says 65 is the magic number, and there's a line there, and 64 is not. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is there anything equivalent to that for a single event that the FAA says, geez, it really shouldn't go over 80 for a single event, or 85? Is there anything like that in the document that we can look at?
So just to answer that question, sorry. So the FAA will only look at the cumulative levels. We did identify in one of our previous meetings a table that identified what the single event levels were for the typical aircraft that are operating at the airport. So we do have that information. However, this report, we are following the FAA standard, and the FAA standard is to use a cumulative metric. And the cumulative metric is the only metric that airports across the United States will use. It will be the 65 DNL. And we do not use single event level noise at all. Even though I can understand people living next to an airport, that is the frustrating point about it. But we do only use the DNL metric.
Okay, when you say we, you're not the FAA.
No, but I respond to the FAA, and this report is for the FAA, and I am responsible as an airport manager to make sure that I am doing what we are supposed to do from a federal standard. And the federal standard is to use DNL.
Right, so if the FAA comes back and says, we'd like to see, and the FAA can add their own stuff to this EA. It's not like they're rubber stamping
And they have.
your
They're-
document.
They've been involved every step of the way.
So, okay, so
Yep.
that's the interesting part I would know, because to me it's like, geez, the FAA says, gee, I wish we could look at sonic booms, but geez, it's not in the DNL. Can't do that. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. And if everyone, when you speak into the microphone, if you could just announce who you are, just so we have it for the recording. Thank you.
I'm Steve Buckley. I used to work for the FAA's
Oh, yes.
environmental office in Washington. I'm from Chatham. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Yes, my name's Paul Hawkins. I live in West Yarmouth. You and I go back about 10 years as well. Is there any sort of data you have that you're under it now? Where were you 5 years ago? Was it at 40 instead of 65?
So basically, the noise contours that you see, and if Alyssa, you can bring those back up, the noise contours show the existing, where they were in 2018, I
well-
think, when those numbers were done, 2018, 2019.
So this particular graphic is showing the future conditions.
Future
We
conditions.
do have existing conditions, it's just not as
But
part
what
of
was
this
it 5
presentation.
years ago?
So the existing conditions is based on 2019
Yeah.
data.
So our operations numbers have changed significantly, as you're aware. The number of flights that come in and out of the airport has changed. I would have to go back to the earlier studies that were done, the earlier master plan, to see what that looked like. But we base this information off of the data that was collected for the master plan. The FAA does require that we look at that. We have a snapshot in time. We look at what's happening at this period in time. So we use the 2018, 2019 data for the existing, and then we forecast that out.
But it's significantly more now to the people that
Actually,
are
it's
here.
not.
Well, there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. Okay, and for the people that live underneath theirs, you hear the noise. Starts early in the morning, goes to 10 o'clock at night, and it's getting worse. Okay, and just to hide behind what the FAA says, as a leader in the community, you should be saying, we want to exceed that for the residents, because I know that, and so the airport's been here for a long time. These homes have been here for longer than an airport expansion, and I don't think that's being taken into consideration. And I know the town of Yarmouth hired a consultant who questions whether you need that length of airport, and he's also proposed he has an alternate flight pattern that now you're saying a year later you're setting up a group to look at. And I think that you're not being proactive and listening to what the people who live around here need.
Thank you for the comments. We are being proactive by conducting a study that is not necessary, according to the FAA. We are doing a procedural study to see if we can make any tweaks to the departure procedures for the airport. That's not a typical requirement, and because we have met the standard from a federal standpoint, we don't necessarily have to do that. But we're responding to the community's concerns and questions to do that. So we are doing this study because we are responding to the town of Yarmouth and to other constituents that live around the airport that have asked for this study. So we are doing that study. It's not part of this study because the FAA indicates that we meet a standard. We do not have 65 DNL that goes into residential community. So we're going above and beyond by conducting an additional study to see if there's tweaks that can be made. And I would love for you to be on that pack if you would, because that is the only way that we can start looking at this holistically and saying, okay, we know we have a standard, but let's start looking to see if there's any tweaks that can be made. And that's the approach that we're taking. In regards to the operations, airport operations, those numbers are available for anybody that wants to go on the FAA website. Airport operations is a landing and a takeoff. And if you look at landings and takeoffs at this airport 20 years ago, they were much higher than they are today. From a number of like 400,000 operations to 60,000 operations where we are today.
For a smaller aircraft, right?
The aircraft have remained
jets.
relatively the same, and the aircraft that were flying in 20 years ago were louder aircraft because they were older aircraft.
But they weren't all these corporate jets that you see go in and out.
They were.
It's fundamentally different.
They were.
I've been here 20 years too.
Yeah.
Never saw it.
That operational data is all in the document, and it's broken out by jets and
And I keep
General
hearing
aviation.
the average, right? I'd like to see what the extremes are, because when you say averages, at nighttime, there's no flight, so that's 0. If you have one flight that goes over at 100, as an average would be 50, the way you average it. You don't have an average noise of the flights. You have an average noise against quiet. And I think that's what's fundamentally different. I know it's an FAA thing, but that's what's fundamentally different. And if you live around the airport and you hear those planes all the time, like this gentleman said, and yes, there's somebody across the table from you, you can't hear what they're saying. And it goes by, but then it goes on and on like that.
Yeah. No, I understand. I do understand.
Hello, Christine Greeley, West Yarmouth. I had a question. I wanted to go back to your comments received page, because I had a question under that it's the 3 columns or whatever. Yes.
Oh, do you want it, the breakout? This
Go back
one?
to the noise. Nope,
No,
Oh, okay, sorry.
go back, let's see here.
there.
That one. When you say in there that it was either a comment letter or a MIPA certificate, can you explain why MIPA was looking at the flight path analysis should be required? What is that requirement? Because I understand the others are all about the noise modeling, things like that, but it looks like besides public comment, there was something on the MIPA. What was their comments and statements?
So essentially, MIPA took the Town of Yarmouth letter and incorporated pretty much verbatim what they said into their certificate. That the airport should consider looking at the takeoff procedure analysis that Katie is talking about as a mitigation measure for the construction of these projects. Not as part of this process, but as a mitigation measure.
Hello, my name is Suzanne Conley. I live in Osterville here in Barnstable. The takeoff procedure analysis, if you were to make any changes, I can't imagine any dimension other than time of takeoffs that you could incorporate into change. I mean, you can't tell a pilot not to, step on it so hard to reduce noise. What are you talking about? What are possible changes that would help the folks who live near this airport live with the noise?
So we've been asked to look at different tweaks that we can make to, for instance, departure procedures. Is there a departure procedure that would have a sharp right-hand or left-hand turn where they're not possibly flying straight out using, straight out from the approach or departure, but they're making a left-hand turn or right-hand turn at a certain point in time, at a certain nautical mile distance from the airport. So those, yes. Right, so those are the types of things that we've been asked to look at and see if that there's any tweaking that can be done to those procedures that we can add to our procedures. I don't know if it would include time. Bob, do you know if it would include time as well?
Well, one of the first things we'll do is talk to PAC and
Can Bob turn that microphone on?
Oh, you gotta, could you?
He has one.
Oh, yeah. Just press the green button.
Like there's this voice.
I guess it would be up to the user expectations. One of the first things you do after you create the PAC is to bring everyone together, talk about the issues, talk about the problems and concerns they have, memorialize them in writing, and try to address them. I can't say right now whether the group is going to talk about time or not, but you certainly can put it on the table.
Yep, thank you. Thanks, Bob.
In the back.
Thanks, sir. My name's Gordon Starr. I live in Barnstable. Even if they were talking about time, do you have any control over time?
Well, the airport is open 24/7. So they can fly in and out at any time that they wish. We can't close it to any type of operation that's federally, that's against the law. We do have voluntary noise procedures that, for the most part, are followed at the airport. We are allowed to put in voluntary, and we do have an education for our pilots to make sure that they're fully aware of those voluntary noise procedures, and it's also included in every lease that we have. So yes, there are certain parts that we can only allow for voluntary adherence to a program. If there were procedural changes that were being made, I'd have to confer with our planning team that's working on this to see what are procedural changes. Does that mean that you're flying a particular heading, and just like if there was an obstruction in your departure path, your regulations would say you fly a particular heading until you hit this altitude, and then you turn to this heading. So those are the type of procedures that would be instituted if we can make those tweaks.
Katie, can I just add to that?
Yeah.
I think the group can make a recommendation, but the Flight Procedures Office from the FAA is the entity that will make the final determination
So
on.
you can't tell somebody to take off and follow a certain path as they leave here and head out over the ocean.
Well, the airport could have a noise abatement procedure that's voluntary, and they
Voluntary,
could
okay.
recommend that. But on a
You
flight
have one.
procedure,
You have one now, right? That's voluntary.
We have one that's voluntary right now, correct?
And what does that encompass? Does that encompass how quickly they climb? Which way
It
they
shows
return?
different avoidance of different areas around the airfield. I don't have it verbatim. We do have it available on our website, and I can certainly send you the link.
So I'm just curious that this takeoff procedure analysis effort, you can make all the recommendations you want, but it doesn't sound like you can make anybody do anything in the end, unless you go to the FAA, which seems to control everything.
Well, as part of this process, we would still have to go to the FAA because they control how those procedures are implemented. They would have to have a say because there are different lines of business within the FAA that are monitoring what's happening from one airport to the next. So we would have to work with them to see if there's any changes. I don't know if, Bob, if you have anything to add to that.
no, except I have been involved with the development of new procedures, and I will say that whatever the airport concludes, I think they'll take it seriously, and I think they'll probably try. But it all depends on what comes out of that effort.
So can you control the, can you make recommendations for the commercial flights and the private planes at the same time? Are they both controlled the same way?
Well, the procedures are really based on the type of aircraft they're flying. And if you look at an approach plate, I don't want to get too technical here, you'll see the different aircraft when they're flying a departure procedure or an approach procedure, they have to follow certain rules. And those rules are published in approach plates and departure plates. So I would say most times a pilot follows those rules. There are occasions when perhaps, let's say there's a flock of birds in his way or her way, and the aircraft pilot wants to avoid. Maybe that would be an instance where they would defer from that flight path. But for the most part, people are flying, the right way.
Okay. The last point is that it says takeoff procedure. In my precinct, I'm more worried about landing procedures because they come in from the northwest, right over Scudder Lane, right over Moshop. They come really low sometimes for a long while, and that it's like if you're in an airplane and there's a screaming baby, they only scream once every half an hour. That one half an hour is going to sort of shake you up every half an hour. It's not like a DNL, the average. So that one scream every half an hour changes your life. So, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Hold on. Any more questions? Okay, so our next topic is the groundwater and aquifer. So the comments primarily focused on what are the existing and future measures to protect water supply? How is groundwater monitored? How will the groundwater be protected during construction? And how are existing water supplies protected? One thing that all the comments seem to have in common was an assumption that there will be a disturbance of the existing capped PFAS areas. There will not be any disturbance of these capped areas. These are areas that the airport has provided a permanent impervious cap so that water cannot infiltrate through the soils and further what's the word I'm looking for? It's late in the day.
Further push PFAS into the water table.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like infiltrate the water further down into the water table. So that is not proposed at any point in part of these projects. Soil sampling, this will continue on current practice of the airport. Soil sampling will be conducted to inform the design of the project so that the airport engineers have a good sense of what is in the soil that they may need to move. And it'll inform the soils management, like where does that soil go if there's excess soil during construction. There's continued monitoring of the groundwater wells. There's a groundwater monitoring well system throughout the airport, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And then the airport has existing SWIP, its Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, for its existing stormwater management infrastructure, as well as a spill prevention control and containment plan. I might have hit one of those C's wrong. So that controls, your hazardous materials on site at the airport. And so those remain in place with federally required monitoring and reporting requirements. And any stormwater management design will be protective of the aquifer.
And I'll just add to that. In general, when we're preparing for any of these projects that are going to go forward, we embed it into the planning and design aspect that soil samples are going to be taken so that we know what we're dealing with. We just had a major construction project on the airport where we reconstructed one of our runways. And as part of that reconstruction, in the areas that we knew that we had to move soil, we did soil samples all along that runway to understand if we had any contaminants that were found, such as PFAS, that could be higher than drinking water standards, and none were found. But we did and went through that process. Any project that we're doing on the airport, we're conscious of PFAS because of our firefighting foams. We know the areas that we sprayed foam on a regular basis, and those have been mitigated, as Alyssa alluded to. But any project moving forward, we're still going to test the soil. And it's also a requirement of the town of Barnstable. Any documentation and project description that I'm putting together to put on my capital plan of a project that I'm going to move forward, there's a section in that documentation that identifies whether or not PFAS is located within the project site. And for the airport, the answer is we are going to look at that, and we're going to take soil samples prior to doing any construction.
Thank you, Katie. As Katie noted, they have done extensive sampling, and there's existing monitoring data and sampling data available. It's all on the airport's website. The airport has collected over the course of the past few. What?
Can I take over on this one?
Oh, sure.
Okay. So monitoring data is available. We have 2 locations where you can get that data from the airport. We have our airport website, which has all of the reports that have been supplied to the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. So all of our reports, I would say the first 30 pages of each report is where you're going to get the information. If you want more technical information, all of the laboratory results are always as appendices to that. The short of it is the airport has collected over 131 samples, as you can see on the screen. Soil samples, 210 groundwater samples. We're continuing to collect more samples as we go. And then 3 surface water samples we're taking from the ponds that are located north of the main airport infrastructure and at the field. The airport conducted forensics analysis, which is fingerprinting. We have a very distinct signature of the PFAS that is located in our firefighting foams. The FAA has required one type of firefighting foam be used only. They had only one that was approved that airports could use. So we know our firefighting foam that has been purchased for over the past 25, going on 25 years now, we have records of all that data. That was able to be fingerprinted. So our team that looked at the soils and the water samples that they collected, they were able to fingerprint what was airport PFAS and what wasn't, what was coming from other industrial sites. North of us is the Barnstable County Firefighting Training Academy. They also had extensive use of firefighting foams, but they had a number of different uses because many different towns used that training facility, and they had different types of firefighting foam. They did not have the firefighting foam that we have, although some did. The main point of it is we only had one. We could only use one. So the Barnstable County has a new consultant that's working for them now. The airport itself is at phase 5 of our analysis of PFAS. Barnstable County is at phase 2, so they still have a ways to go. They are utilizing some of the data that we've already collected. We've made it available to them. Now that we're in phase 5, which really at phase 5 is a monitoring phase, it's basically identifying, are your caps working? Are your mitigation caps working? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? We have to test that and write a report to Mass DEP twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall in October. So we indicated that every November we are going to give a public meeting that identifies what are the samples telling us. Where has PFAS gone? Is our mitigating caps working as they should? And so every November we're going to have a meeting that goes over this. 2 weeks ago I was in a meeting with Barnstable Fire Training Academy because we have monthly meetings with them to make sure we're all on the same page. They have the data available to them from our studies. They're collecting more studies. We're asking for their data share with us, and they're doing that, and we're doing it vice versa with them. I suggested to them that we have a November meeting with both of us so that the public only has to go to one meeting, because the comments that we've received from our community have been that it's confusing because we have Barnstable Fire Training Academy and we have the airport, what's happening down gradient of these two locations. And so we're going to have a joint meeting in November where the airport will present where we are in our findings and Barnstable County will present where they are in theirs, and we'll have a question and answer session for everyone at that point in time. So sorry, Alyssa, I just wanted to jump on that. The airport plume has been identified. We have all water comes from the north and kind of comes around towards the Maher wells, which are located right next to Yarmouth. There's 3 wells, drinking water wells at Maher. They are picking up anything that's coming from Barnstable Fire Training Academy and from the airport. Again, we fingerprinted what our impact is. Only one of the 3 wells are being affected by the airport's PFAS. We've identified that through modeling of the water table and how it's moving, and through soil and water samples that we're taking. So we know where it's going. Eventually, because of our mitigation caps, that plume will detach itself because there will be no more, it'll detach, meaning that rainwater is no longer can filtrate through those caps that have been created. Therefore, they're not pushing PFAS through that soil into the groundwater, and eventually that plume will detach itself because it's not being fed by PFAS anymore. Right now, the PFAS that is getting from the airport to the Maher wells is being treated at the Maher wells through carbon filtration. And the Maher wells are making sure that drinking water standards are being met, and they are. So there's clean water that's coming out of the Maher wells, even though we know that there's a PFAS plume from the airport that's coming to one of the 3 wells. The Barnstable Fire Training Academy is still in the process of identifying where their plume is. They haven't done that yet. So hopefully, probably not for the November meeting, probably sometime after that, you'll see a plume map of what Barnstable Fire Training Academy has. We're continuing to do our monitoring associated with PFAS. And then in regards to groundwater, and I'll have Alyssa step back up here, other required monitoring will be done as necessary as we step through these projects. Like any project that we do at the airport, we have to follow the local, state, and federal standards for any type of monitoring that may be required. Alyssa?
Thank you, Katie. So for future projects, one of the key components to protection of the aquifer is what is the proposed stormwater management. The stormwater management for projects will be in full compliance with whatever the current DEP standards are for stormwater management. And I say current because they're currently undergoing a regulatory revision to become more stringent. And those revisions are anticipated by the end of this year, although sometimes I haven't heard anything about them, any updates recently, so hopefully we'll know what they are. But drafts were reviewed earlier this year, and that these revised standards take into effect increased precipitation rates, increased climate resiliency measures, et cetera. So the design will take into consideration the more resilient, low-impact development and green infrastructure, best management practices that could be used on the airport. They'll also consider, as I mentioned, the increased precipitation rates as well as the larger storm events that have been occurring. And finally, these new revisions also require an increased recharge or infiltration of stormwater. So all of these, and any stormwater that is infiltrated is pre-treated as part of the requirements. The airport is a little bit limited. There are certain practices that they cannot implement on an airfield. For example, anything that has open standing water, like a stormwater retention basin or something like that, that may attract waterfowl and be a wildlife hazard to airplanes. Wrong one.
It's hard to see.
Yeah, so I'm going to zoom right in. So this map basically identifies a selection of the airport, and each one of these blue dots is one of the groundwater monitoring wells that the airport has as part of its PFAS investigation. And these green, these are the Mahar wells, and then there's some additional drinking water supply wells to the north of the airport. So with all that data comes from a lot of these different monitoring wells. Mm-hmm. And so as projects are constructed, if additional wells are required by DEP, they will be implemented. So, any questions related to groundwater aquifer protection?
I'm reminded that there was some question of contamination from de-icing materials. And is that an ongoing issue, or has that material changed in its composition?
So the airport does not use any de-icing fluids to clear runways and taxiways during snow season, for instance. We are not allowed to use that because of the aquifer that we sit on. There are aircraft that use de-icing fluids to de-ice the aircraft itself during inclement weather, and we have a de-icing pad. So we have a pad that's dedicated to de-icing and aircraft washing. All of that liquid goes into the sanitary sewer system, and it is treated at the sanitary sewer facility. So none of that goes into storm water. It's a asphalt pad that has drainage systems that go direct drainage to sanitary sewer.
Yeah, so one of your last meetings, you said that there was a plume that's going under the airport. Is there any update on that for where it's coming from, or will this runway expansion, is that going to go into that area where that where that plume is that's not airport related?
So I'm not sure which plume you're talking about. The only thing I can think of is perhaps the plume.
Wendy's, is there Wendy's or something?
Yes, there is a plume that's near Wendy's, and it's not coming from the airport. It's actually
Going under the airport, right?
right, but it's not associated with the airport. There's nothing from that plume that is associated with airport activities. It's coming from somewhere north of the airport, north of the boundary of the airport.
With this expansion, is it going into that area? And if so, what are you going to be doing so that you're not adding water into that plume?
Yeah, so none of the proposed projects are in that area. All of the proposed projects are north of that area, so it's the runway and then the 3 taxiways that we're looking at, as well as any type of terminal projects that we come up with for enhancement to the terminal building. So none of that is in close proximity to where that plume is coming from. It's actually coming from the north and to the southeast of the airport property.
Okay. One other question is a problem with hydraulic fluid? Does that add to that factor? Hydraulic fluids?
How so? What do you mean for?
Well, there's hydraulic fluids that are used in planes, correct?
Right.
Now, can that get into the ground? And what impact
If,
does that
if
have?
there's a spill, yes. Alyssa alluded to our stormwater pollution and prevention plan that we have in place. The stormwater pollution and prevention plan, we have an interconnection of a number of our drainage swales and drainage areas, whether they're in the grass or on the pavement. Those drainage areas typically go to an underground chamber that basically pre-treats anything that's coming off of the airport. So those are cleaned out on a regular basis. We have a number of those underground chambers that are at the airport. We have oil water separators that are at the airport. So if there's a spill that we're unaware of that happens and nobody tells us that it happens, there's still containment through the system. Now, typically, all of our tenants are part of that stormwater pollution and prevention plan. They have to sign off on that plan. So they know that if they have some type of spill, we have to be notified. It's a requirement that we're notified. I haven't seen anybody not notify us. And, you know, since Matt and I have been here, if anything were to happen, they do notify us right away. All of our vehicles, for our operations vehicles, and all of our tenants have spill containment kits. So they have ways that if, for God forbid, there were a spill, they have ways that they can contain that through different covers that they can put on any of the catch basins. They can put protective booms around the catch basins. They can put kitty litter, for a better term, but it's kitty litter, to absorb any type of spill that occurs. It has happened at the airport. We're a transportation facility, so it has happened. Any type of spill that occurs at the airport, we have to notify DEP. We have an on-call licensed site professional that responds immediately if there's anything that happens at the airport. We also have a lot of best management practices in place. In terms of, you know, being conscious of those things. You know, nobody wants to have a spill or have to clean up a spill. And we train this, and we make sure our staff and our tenants are fully aware of that.
And is that part of the DNA for your PFAS, all of those chemicals?
Say that again?
Has all those chemicals so the airport uses, is that part of that DNA package for the plume that's created by the airport?
So the plume that...
I hear the foam, but I didn't hear any of those other fluids as being part of, it's like the DNA for your profile.
No, so we identify in our stormwater plan what materials are on airport that are considered hazardous materials. So jet fuel, hydraulic fluids, oils that are used by any of the maintenance facilities at the airport. They identify what those substances are and then where they're stored. And every year we do an audit of all of our tenants to identify, are you following best management practices? Are you making sure that these are stored appropriately? If we know anything, we make changes to the program. We make our tenants make changes. But for the most part, because they're signatories of that document, they know what their requirements are and they maintain that. And then on a regular basis, we are checking, usually during a rain event, we're checking our outfalls. And we're doing a sample of those outfalls and making sure that in that sample, are we finding anything? Is there anything of substance that we need to be concerned about? And then we report that back to EPA, and that's what our requirement is. Every year, we're also required to do our own audit for the EPA and provide them with reports. And all of this is available. Any of the reports that you want to look at, they're available.
That's Steve Buckley again. This might be a question for the FAA, but if you know the answer, then that's almost as good. There was somebody from the FAA at the Zoom meeting today, but unfortunately they're not here. Anyway, you had said something about PFAS, that the FAA had required PFAS to be used, or something along those lines, for 25 years, and now, of course, everybody's discovered that it's not a good thing anymore. So
they required the firefighting foam to be used that has PFAS in it.
Right.
Yes.
And they decided there was a significant impact from PFAS. So even though it was, I'm just pointing out that example of where it's not written in stone that something that FAA said was not significant effect, then they discover, well, maybe it is. So the idea of being handcuffed by FAA, written in stone is I'm just pointing, that's an example of where they changed,
No,
changed their mind.
that's
And I
a
know
good
that's not your
example.
call. I know
Yeah.
that's not your call.
Yeah, no, but that's a good example, and I'll go back to the noise comment that was made during the Zoom meeting today. There was a question about the noise study, how it's studied, and how the FAA, the metric that they used. And the FAA just went through a pretty significant public process to see if there's a way that they should change how noise is studied at airports and the metrics that are used. And today they said they received over 9,000 comments from across the United States from, concerned citizens that want to see that there's a change that's being made. And they're going through those comments now. If the FAA comes back to us and says, this is the new rule, this is the new requirement, then we're going to follow suit. Right now, we're following the standard that exists today, but that doesn't mean that a new standard will come forward and make a change for airports. Case in point, a lot of these taxiways that are part of this master plan and this environmental review were taxiways that were designed oftentimes when military installations had control of the airport. The same standards back in the 40s are not the standards of today. So the three taxiways, actually two of the three taxiways that we're modifying are to meet the standards that FAA wants to see today that weren't in place in the 40s, but we never changed the dimensions and the way that a taxiway enters the runway environment. So now we're making those changes because that's mandated by the FAA. Same thing with noise, same thing with water quality. If there's a change, then we'll follow suit with what those new standards are. Right now, we're following the standards that are in place today, but that always changes.
Okay, just as an aside, the federal law that applies to all federal agencies says NEPA, the key word is significant. And yes, as an engineer, I always want to be able to measure when do you get to that significant part. So I understand totally. Having worked for FAA as well, it's like, well, what is the threshold?
What is significant?
What is the threshold? And so a lot of times, unfortunately, it goes to court and the judge decides. And it's a judgment call, basically. There's no thing. But the idea being that one of the things is that if there's a public outcry, if 1,000 people are saying that they're jumping out of their seats once a day, then it doesn't look, then the modeling doesn't really, it doesn't say, well, we wish we could do an environmental impact statement, but we can't. It's like, no, they can if they want to. So anyway, thank you.
I have a question in that you said that the airport was using a certain firefighting foam. Were all of the any of the tenants on the property, such as Cape Air and that, using the same foam, or was it their own? What was the story?
So we are the only entity on the airport that responds to fires or incidents at the airport. We have our own firefighting team. Cape Air and our other tenants do not have a firefighting team. They rely on the airport's response. So because we are a certificated airport through the FAA, we're a 139 airport. And what that means is we have certain criteria that we meet to be able to accommodate commercial service aircraft. In that accommodation, we have to supply a certain level of goods, services, and team staff to be able to respond to 139 regulations. Firefighting is one of them, and the foam that we use was mandated by the FAA that we use a certain foam. And the reason why it's mandated is because it has the ability to blanket a fire if, God forbid, were to happen, in a way that is a proportion that FAA is happy with. The combination of water and foam builds a protective layer, a barrier. The FAA has been, over the past year, looking at a new firefighting foam that can use that's supposedly PFAS-free. I know Matt's been working diligently on that with the companies, the two companies that are supplying that to the FAA. They're being studied right now. The good thing about that new firefighting foam is that they are creating that foam, and Matt, please correct me if I'm wrong, in completely new facilities, so they're not using the same piping that was used for foam that was created for, that had PFAS in it, because it is residual. It will stay in those entities. They're using new equipment to create this foam. Is that correct, Matt? Yeah.
Okay, yes, only because I wondered, because of the fact that there's this claim for the other industrial sites, and clearly coming down from Wendy's is sort of where the Cape Air hangars are, things like that. I just kept wondering if there's been any identification at all of where the other industrial sites should be, or if the town has had any interest in that. Thank you.
Yeah, so they have identified unknown sources, if you will, and we've identified that to the Department of Environmental Protection, because it's then sits in their arena to go after any other industrial sites that are unknown. So these unknowns are hard to pinpoint because there's industrial activity that's happening north of the airport along Independence that some of these companies have even closed. And we know that and there was a refrigerant company that was located north of the airport that has since gone out of business. But that doesn't mean that their industrial activities are not still lingering. And we know that PFAS stays around for a long time. It's those unknowns that I don't know at this point in time what EPA or DEP would do to those private entities. So right now they're hitting on the known sources, airports, firefighting academy, and other known industrial sites that have used PFAS material. No. That's correct. That's correct.
Thank you, Katie. And so my question is, and it's probably coming into the party too late, is that it bothers me that the PFAS is staying where it is. You know, that we're not doing pump and treat, and we're just leaving it underneath a cap. But that decision's already been made?
That's correct. So when we identified our possible mitigation efforts, the capping was one of the efforts, the pump and treat was another effort. Because we are so close to the Maher well system, and they're essentially doing a pump and treat, because they're pulling in that water to the Maher wells, they're treating it with their carbon filtration, and that's essentially what a pump and treat would do. We identified where a possible pump and treat filtration line could go for the airport, and it would be in areas that are outside of the airport's control, in the road along Yarmouth Road, and it would be too close to Maher wells that actually it could draw away from the water that Maher needs just to supply to its residents and to the community. So it was deemed inappropriate for us to put a pump and treat in.
Okay, so it'll be there a long while.
It's capped. It is capped,
Yeah.
yes. Mm-hmm.
So my other question is that there's only one of the Maher wells is actually capturing the bullet as it's going by. Is it capturing all of the bullet?
Yes, from according to the modeling that we have done from the airport's two sites, it is capturing, it's drawing into Maher well number 3, I believe, all of the airport's plume.
So can you test that in a concrete way besides modeling? I mean, have you?
Yes, we have.
Are there wells downstream of the Maher wells? Okay.
There are.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, moving on. Moving on to air quality and greenhouse gas emissions. I am also going to point out that there's some comment topics on tree cutting, tree removal, and how that affects air quality. And that will be next. I know it overlaps. So some of the comments were hangar development should be incorporated into the emissions analysis. We should prepare an emissions inventory. And plane emissions are concerning to human health. So to address the first comment. Any operational changes from hangar development is reflected in the operation forecasts and was reflected in our analysis. This goes back to what does the regulations require? So the airport the federal government, and I'm sorry if I'm tripping over my words, air quality is a tricky subject. The federal air quality standards for NAAQS, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the airport the state of Massachusetts is in attainment for those air quality standards. So based on FAA guidance and technical guidance, an emissions inventory is not required. And that's from the federal side of things. We did look at, in the draft EIR, overall what emissions, what these attainment standards are, and how the airport is in attainment. From a state side of things, the airport is committed to stretch code requirements for new buildings. So this refers to the energy efficiency use of any new building. So any hangars or building modifications, the airport has committed as a mitigation measure to meet these stretch code requirements. So as these hangars are designed, they will be designed to incorporate energy efficiency measures that meet these requirements.
I just had one thing.
Yep.
We've also included, a couple of years ago, we have a standard or guidelines for our airport tenants, and we updated it, probably about 4 years ago, we updated it. And it's guidelines that basically refer our tenants to green initiatives that they can implement for any upgrades that they're doing to their existing buildings or any new buildings that come on site. We also attached all of the Cape Cod Commission's reports on how development can occur on Cape Cod that gets to the root of being more green savvy when they're coming to development on Cape Cod. So we've attached those to our guidelines for construction. We haven't had any new buildings except for one T hangar that was removed and replaced because it was built in the 1970s and it was rusting away. But besides that building, we haven't had any new buildings develop at the airport. We do have some existing buildings that have been made solar ready. So Griffin Avionics is one of our tenants that's been there for almost 40 years. They are getting ready, hopefully within the next month or so, to redo their roof and put solar on that roof. Cape Air, their 2 buildings that they lease from the airport have solar. Aloft Aviation just renovated one of the hangars on the airport, on the east side of the airport. He put a new roof on, and that is also solar ready. So, and we're also looking at putting in electric vehicle charging stations that we received a grant from the state for, and we are putting in the first, our first, not the first in Massachusetts, but our first electric aircraft charging station that has dual ports so that you can charge vehicles or aircraft. And so that will be the first for us. But we're conscious of this. We're conscious of the way that we have to develop on Cape Cod and anywhere now. So that stretch code and those thoughts of how to better develop, we're taking that into consideration. WS Development, the former location of Kmart, they already told me about 3 months ago that they're seeking to put solar on those buildings, which I think is a fantastic move on their part. So, thanks.
Skipping around a little bit, to continue with the hangar emissions. So we'll also continue to consider this topic once a lessee or a developer is on board for a hangar development, and we'll look at a supplemental filing with MEPA as may be necessary and do an emissions inventory for that specific hangar building and construction period. Jumping back to about aircraft, and Katie mentioned this relative to noise, newer aircraft are becoming much more efficient with their fuel consumption and much lower emissions. So for example, the aircraft that JetBlue is switching to, the A220, has 20% less emissions than the E190 aircraft. And FAA has also issued a new final rule governing civil aircraft that is designed to also reduce emissions. And they also have a Get the Lead Out program for single-engine piston aircraft that use leaded gasoline. So any questions on those topics or concerns? Yes?
What's the difference between hangar emissions and aircraft emissions? I mean, I think we all know, we see the plume coming out of the tail end of those planes as they're leaving and that, but what's a hangar emission? Thank you.
Sure. The hangar emission looks at more the building envelope, and for example, like the HVAC equipment used, if there's a contained section of the hangar for offices, bathroom space, what is the energy used for that space? For heating, for cooling, for electricity usage, et cetera. And it also looks at what are the construction period impacts, all those construction vehicles as well.
Thank you, Katie. I just want to commend you for sticking with the stretch code and thinking forward with the solar panels and the electric vehicles, and sounds good. I like it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you aware if there is any use of SF6 gas at the airport, for example, in your power plant, anything like that?
So for sustainable aviation fuels, oftentimes if they're using it, they're mixing it within the existing jet fuel use or the existing stream. It's almost unknown to us. So I don't think at this point in time the company that we use for our jet fuel supply is World Fuel. I don't think they're using sustainable fuels yet. Do you know? Yeah, I don't think so. I also think that it's something that's coming. It's just not here yet. About 2 years ago, I went to a conference that talked about the use of sustainable aviation fuels. You're finding it more on the West Coast where they're using ethanol-based and different types of fuels, but it hasn't come across here yet to the East Coast. There's a supply chain issue with that and the ability for some of these facilities to make that type of fuel. I think eventually we'll get there. We made it to the moon in 10 years, and we're still talking about different types of fuel that we need to use for existing aircraft and vehicles. I'm hoping that we get there at some point.
She asked about SF6, sulfuric. I don't know what it is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's a gas that's used mostly in electric transformer stations.
Not that I know of yet, but I would have to look into that. I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about sustainable aviation fuels. Sorry.
No, I was just wondering, you mentioned there are certain toxic substances at the airport, and I was just wondering if SF6 was one of those.
Don't think it's on the list.
I
It doesn't
don't
ring a
think it
bell.
is either because I don't recognize that from any of our stormwater, but I can ask the question of our licensed site professional. I think it would be in that list that's available of what the hazardous materials are in the airport because we have to recognize everything for EPA. Yeah, Matt, do we have the SWIP on our website? If not, I can put it up there.
It's part of the draft EA too.
Oh, yeah, that's
as
right,
an
it is.
appendix.
Yeah, but
That is on the website now. So if you download the appendices, it's in there.
Thank you, thank you. I'll find it. If you leave your email, I'll find it and I'll email you with a link so you don't have to hunt and peck for it.
Yeah, Steve Buckley. Did I see a slide, Alyssa, that said an emissions inventory is not required?
That's correct.
And that's because why?
Because we're in an attainment area and we don't exceed any of the operational thresholds that that the proposed projects anticipate to exceed, I'm sorry, let's take a step back. We don't exceed those thresholds that would require an emissions inventory as part of the EA from the federal standpoint. From the state standpoint, they're, by committing to meeting the stretch code requirements for like landside facilities, you don't have to do a separate greenhouse gas analysis or specific inventory as part of this process, but potentially in the future. And we would do an emissions inventory related to construction, period.
Okay, and I guess just to clarify, inventory would be a calculation of the total
Correct.
Annual emissions.
Yes, off the top of my head, I don't know exactly what the metric is that what the output is. But
Okay,
yes.
but the idea that
Yes,
it's
and
not
there,
just
right,
it's
and
not
there's
just a list of different it's the totals.
right, and again, you have to input very specific information, like for example, for construction equipment, what type of bulldozer you're using and how many trips per day it's going to take and for how many days. So that's all part of the inventory process. That's also using the AEDT tool on the federal side of things. So
Right. Well, it doesn't have to go into those details. I used ones that were just like, semi-tractor trucks. You didn't have to know what kind of truck it was. So you can get a rough idea. But,
yes,
but it's not going to be there at all.
Right. From a construction standpoint, we haven't done that yet because we don't, we're so conceptual. But the draft EA does include some approximations. So not a formal model emissions inventory, but there is documented information in there and calculations.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions on air quality? Okay. If we can move on to the wetland impacts.
Yay. All right, so the wetland impacts and, the wetland impact comments pertain to one particular project, the Taxiway D parallel taxiway project. The other projects that are proposed as part of the master plan do not have any wetland impacts associated with them. So this is really just in reference to one particular project. One of the comments was there are too many wetland impacts. There are no details on wetland mitigation requirements. That the sediments in the pond can affect the groundwater quality. So the steps that we took to address these comments is we continued to look at the conceptual design for the taxiway and see if there were any further refinements we could make to minimize even further our impacts. Generally speaking, in Massachusetts, one of the impact thresholds from a permitting perspective that you look at is 5,000 square feet. Under 5,000 square feet, this is a project that's permittable at the state level, permittable by the state at the local level. Anything above 5,000 square feet, now you have to go to the state for a permit. And so even though we were below that 5,000 square feet threshold, we were able to reduce it even further by 35% to 3,000 square feet. And that's the impact to vegetated wetlands. For the mitigation, the mitigation means how do you offset those impacts to those wetlands under the regulatory requirements. In this case, they're quite well defined in the regulations, and you have a one-to-one wetland replication requirement. You need to create a wetland that's the same size or bigger to what you impacted. So we were able to identify that wetland replication area on airport and provide a conceptual plan. I'll get, then the next slide, I'll get into that, provide some additional details on what that wetland would look like, and this design will be finalized during the permitting phase. We also identified best management practices that can be used to isolate the work area within the pond, or I used a term LUW, which stands for land underwater, within the pond to avoid sediment disturbance to the water column to the rest of the pond during construction. And we also did some background research, and we identified that the pond actually itself does not interact with the groundwater. The groundwater is elevation is tens of feet below the pond. So the pond sits up and is isolated. So the design alternative, so this is Upper Gate Pond here, and this is the proposed taxiway. And so what this red line here notes is this is the alternative that was presented in the draft document. And through the removal of a perimeter access road that accompanied the taxiway, we were able to pull back the limit of work, which is now kind of the shading, gray shading here. And so really reduce, the wetland impacts associated with the pond to that 3,000 square feet, and reduce, some land alterations and vegetation clearing. The wetland replication area is located on the same water body. This is Upper Gate Pond on the northern side of the airport. So the wetland replication area is right now this purple blob in this corner of the pond. And so this is conceptually located. The shape and contours will be further refined during the design permitting process. This is just a site photograph of that particular area, and then some typical view of the pond in that area. This particular pond has very steep banks. So these two dark contours are 10 feet change in elevation, so it's a pretty steep drop down into the pond. So any questions related to wetlands?
No, he's coming over.
I'm really surprised to hear that the pond does not interact with the groundwater because of replenishment patterns here on Cape Cod. You're really sure about that?
So in the sense that the bottom elevation of the pond does not intersect the level of groundwater. The groundwater, the aquifer is much further below.
Right, but it's fed by replenishment of
Right,
rainwater.
so there is infiltration, but
okay.
it's not, so it doesn't intersect, is what I'm trying to say.
Right, but it interacts.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you. It's called a perched pond, so it's perched above the water level. Generally, those ponds have clay bottoms to them. Right, so it's perched way above the water table. So it's not, most ponds are a reflection of the water table, the way it is. Some perch ponds in this area and on the north side where there's more clay tend to be perched. So how deep is this pond?
Not very deep.
Not very, okay.
I don't know the exact elevation, but I can get that for you because it was part of some of the PFAS studies, so I'll find out for you.
Okay.
It's in the report. I think, isn't it one of the attachments in there?
We did do a partial bathymetric survey to determine the depth of sediment at the bottom of the pond, but we didn't do a whole pond
So the
bathymetric
process
survey.
is to fill in sort of an edge of the pond, and then dig out on that top right. You're going to fill it like on the bottom, on the right-hand corner right there. You're gonna
Yes,
fill
there
that
will
in.
be a portion of the pond. I think it's about 11,000 square feet of pond, open water, that will be filled in, yes.
11,000 square feet
Of open water ponds, yes.
that will be filled in?
Yes.
But you said you weren't going more than 5,000 square feet.
Vegetated wetland impacts is that 5,000 square foot threshold. Yeah. Open water.
Open water is different? Okay.
Under the state regulations, it's a different resource area. They classify bordering vegetated wetlands and land underwater. We have inland bank. Yes, they're all considered separate resources with separate impact thresholds.
So next slide, please. Next slide, that one. Are you going to dig that out?
Yes.
It is, okay. And some of it will be open water or not? It'll just be wetland?
The intent is to have it be vegetated wetlands. There isn't a regulatory requirement to replicate open water. There's a requirement to meet some of the same values and interests that resource area provides. So things like wildlife habitat, groundwater protection, things like that. So those characteristics will be incorporated into the replication area.
So how big is the replication area?
The replication, it'll be a 1-to-1, so it'll be at least 3,000 square feet. I like to size them up at least 10% bigger for a margin of error. So,
So we're basically losing a quarter of an acre of open water.
well, yes, but I mean, it's not quite open water. It's very, it's very mucky,
habitat,
murky.
okay.
Yes, it's
Okay.
habitat. That is correct.
And has somebody done a biological study of what's in there? Do we know what's in there?
Not at this time. That would be done at the permitting phase, and those assessments would be done at that time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, tree removal is our next topic. So tree removal is associated with discrete projects. A little bit of taxiway D requires some tree removal, and then one of the proposed hangar development areas, when that does get developed, that requires tree removal. Just to be clear, the runway extension does not. There is no tree removal associated with the runway extension. So the comments were, as mitigation, a conservation restriction should be evaluated as a possibility. Should look to minimize the tree and shrub clearing and be able to offset those impacts with tree plantings and buffer enhancements around the airport, and look to have a reuse of the wood products to provide a whole kind of a whole cycle use of the tree. So we did take a look at the airport property, and conservation restrictions are just most likely infeasible on the airport property as a mitigation measure. But other mitigation measures that we've identified and committed to, the airport's participating in the Greening Hyannis tree planting program. That's a new program that the town started this year to plant trees in environmental justice communities. And the airport is surrounded by environmental justice communities. So the airport is participating in that. We've identified airport areas for tree planting and enhancement landscaping, and identified different ways to reuse the wood chips from the tree removal for erosion control during construction, for example, or for vegetation control along fence lines, or mulching in planting beds. And we've also reduced the tree clearing area or shrub clearing area associated with taxiway D by about almost a full acre.
And we have reused chips from tree clearing that we've done in the past, and we used it for landscaping around our terminal building.
So any questions on tree cutting? Moving on. Okay, public health and environmental justice. So this topic overlaps a lot with some of the other topics we've already discussed, like air quality and water quality. So I think we've hit on some of these bullet points during our conversations on other slides as it relates to the mitigation of historical PFAS impacts, making sure that we're maintaining an updated environmental justice email list, and identifying additional mitigation measures that the airport can implement that would benefit the environmental justice communities. So as Katie noted, the airport has funded treatment at the Mahar Wells that was implemented in 2020. Relative to all historical PFAS impacts, the airport is mitigating the airport's impacts, and non-airport related plumes are required by regulation to be mitigated by the responsible parties. So as Katie noted, some of those are known, some are not, and that is a state level action that needs to occur. We've continuously updated our stakeholder list and obtained updated contact information from the state MEPA Environmental Justice Office, and they've reviewed our distribution notice. And our prior meetings, we've offered translation services, materials have been translated, et cetera, to make sure that we're trying to reach all the communities out there. The airport is supporting electric aviation and use of sustainable aviation fuels, so that kind of ties into some of these air quality, greenhouse gas emission concerns. As well as the airport will look into DEP grant programs to acquire air quality monitors. So, any further questions? Yep.
It's always interesting to see the word stakeholder used, and different agencies use it in different ways. And so I'm wondering, as long as you brought it up, what
Sure.
the stakeholder list, who is a stakeholder and who is not?
Well, in this case, that refers to our ongoing communication distribution list that encompasses the state and federal agencies that are required to review, provide comments on the document, and at the local level. It includes people who have requested communications, either via one of these public meeting opportunities or via email or via the email that we've set up. And then it also includes, like I said, the state has environmental justice stakeholder lists that they require that you review and update for each communication.
Okay, I just raised it because a lot of times I see the phrase stakeholders and the public, as if the public was not a stakeholder.
They are a stakeholder.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
there's
Yeah,
two
I
schools of thought. I'm just saying.
I think
just
we're up
wanted
to
see,
over 300 names on just
Okay,
the.
no, I appreciate that, and I would say, just as an aside, that your presentation and your addressing the public and so forth has definitely a different vibe than the Chatham Airport Commission, which has been going through a similar master plan upgrade and also projects and cutting of trees and environmental assessment for noise and so forth and so on. And they've, to be blunt, have been dismissive. They have rubbed people the wrong way. And it showed up at town meeting when they tried to get some EV, electric vehicle charging ports, which everybody's in favor of that. No. So anyways, and so I just thought I'd point out that you're doing a better job than they are. And nonetheless, I see that it seems to be a push at the federal level to actually federal agencies do more than just delegate too much of the public engagement to consultants and like yourself. So you're doing a good job, but it's still, at some point, they need to step in and do that. So I think the good news is that things will get better in the future, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments.
With the issue of public health and all, has there been any looking at and review of like the tough study that came out about aircraft emissions and that in terms of the considerations of this? Because as I recall, what they indicated was that the larger aircraft are not an issue, but the smaller are, and this airport is quite heavily used by smaller aircrafts. So I wondered if you had been looking at that report or had considered it. Thank you.
So I think that speaks more to, kind of a aviation-wide challenge. I'm not familiar with that specific report, but we do have folks on our team that probably are, and that contributed to our EA. There have been a number of new rulemaking decisions, issued by FAA relative to, for example, the leaded fuels and pediatric health concerns with that. So 100% that was something that we looked at in the draft EA. Off the top of my head, I can't speak to that specific study, but that was addressed in one of our documents, yes.
And we're rounding this out. We're almost done, folks. The comments that were received regarding airport usage and the location of the airport. So we did receive a number of comments. Again, they're up at the top. The comments that we received were that the terminal building doesn't need expanding. That's one of the projects that's listed from the master plan and in this environmental review. Another comment received is that only the rich private jet users need the airport and it doesn't benefit the community as a whole. And then close the airport and move to Joint Base Cape Cod was another comment that we received. I'll go through all of these. I do give a little bit of background in regards to the airport, just because oftentimes I find that we go into public settings like this and there's a miscommunication about what the airport does in a community. And I think it takes everybody that's part of the community to listen to the airport, but the airport to listen to the community as well. So I'd like to provide a little bit of background about what this airport is within this area. So in regards to the terminal building, we're looking at reconfiguration of space proposed for the initial phase to meet the airport's use and need. The airport also serves many different types of users, and oftentimes it's misconstrued that we're only usable by one type of user, so I'll go over that. And then the MEPA office accepted the fact that Joint Base Cape Cod is not a feasible option, and it's not a feasible alternative, and the FAA has indicated that they will not study airport closure. So going into the terminal expansion and modifications are needed to adequately respond to passenger needs now and in the future. I put in a picture of what our post-security waiting area looked like on the lower left-hand side. As you can see there, it is completely jam-packed. Almost every single seat is in use. We experienced that this year when we had 3 flights happening in close proximity to each other. American Airlines seasonal flights, JetBlue seasonal flights, and Cape Air seasonal flights. We know that to comfortably accommodate our passengers, we need to do something. Seasonal-wise, we can look at a temporary structure. We can look at what the Vineyard uses, a tent. In inclement weather, that's not an ideal solution. It gets hot out there on the apron. So obviously we'd like to provide something that's a little bit more appropriate so that our customers are comfortable. We can accommodate roughly about 130 to 138 people comfortably in that space. It's about just over 2,000 square feet. So we know we need to do something. And with American Airlines and their successful flights this year, they are coming back next year for more seasons, and they're adding additional flights to additional cities. So this space is only going to get more crowded. Seasonal flights, again, we're seeing that they are overwhelming the secure checkpoint. So in regards to the airport, this is the slide that I told you about just to give you some background. We're one of 9 enterprise funds of the town of Barnstable. We are a department of the town of Barnstable, but we are an enterprise fund. What does that mean? That means that we are not tax funded by the residents of Barnstable. We have to set our rates and charges to charge our customers that use the airport, and then we use those fees that we collect in the form of revenues to operate the airport and to pay for the operations of the facility and maintenance of the facility. The airport pays the town of Barnstable over $1.6 million annually. So I don't have my own HR services at the airport. I don't have my own IT services at the airport. I pay for that benefit to the town of Barnstable. I pay them for those services. All the enterprise funds pay an indirect fee. Our tenants that own their buildings on the airport, they pay taxes to the town, about $700,000. I think the last check, it was like $730,000. You can look on the assessor's website to see what the airport tenants are paying. But roughly, that's about $1.6 million. The 2020 economic impact analysis was done by the State Aeronautics Division. They're updating that, so I hope that we're going to see an update sometime in maybe 2025, 2026. They have 2 reports that they're working on right now. The economic impact study is the latter, so hopefully we'll see that sooner rather than later, but I'm guessing probably in like 2026. 65 tenants associated at the airport in their businesses, employing over 1,700 employees at an annual payroll of nearly $74 million. These numbers, again, were 2020. We have new tenants on the airport. We have new operations on the airport, so these numbers most likely have grown. With the onset of American Airlines, that's adding more jobs at the airport. JetBlue, their seasonal flights have added more jobs at the airport, so that's really changed the dynamic. The regional economic output is 157 million. Again, 2020 numbers, and I guarantee that those have grown since 2020. The current federal funding program is the Airport Improvement Program. Oftentimes I hear that we're using taxpayers' dollars to operate and maintain the facility. We are, but the taxpayers are users of the airport. So AIP is drawn from the Airways Trust Fund, the Airport and Airway Trust Fund. It's supported by aviation user fees. So fuel fees at the airport, other fees that are associated with the aviation industry pay into that trust fund. And that's the money that we get for development at the airport. Looking at this graphic, one of the things that people are very surprised to hear is that there's 3,300 airports in the United States that are open to the public. The graphic on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a lot of blue dots on that. That's the vast majority of airports in the United States, and guess what? They're not commercial service. The vast majority of airports in the United States are not commercial service airports. Only 11% of those 3,300 airports are open for you to fly in and fly out on a commercial flight. So that's 383 airports in all of the United States, and we are one of them. The type of airport that we are is a airport that typically sees operations that have a higher majority that are coming from what we call general aviation operations. That's everything outside of military and commercial. So that's the corporate jets that you see operating at the airport. That's the single engine aircraft that they decided to fly in for a hamburger downtown. That's the kids from Barnstable High School that want to learn how to fly. Those are those other types of operations that are occurring at the airport, and that's about 56% of our operations. About 41% is commercial service with American Airlines, JetBlue, and Cape Air, and air taxi services, and less than 2% is military services. Airports that fall into our same category, I'll go back to that slide. You think of Boston Logan, Chicago O'Hare. Those are a lesser of percentage for those commercial service airports. Airports like Cape Cod Gateway, similar airports would be Martha's Vineyard Airport, Nantucket Airport. They're very much like ours, where a higher majority of operations are in that general aviation fleet. So when we have comments about the airport that, there's no activity at the airport. Well, there's a lot of activity at the airport. We only have 3 airlines, but there's a lot of activity that's outside of airline activity. So going back to the location, just looking at, I've already went over some of the numbers. The airport has been identified as not being busy. In the 6 years that I've been airport manager, I've been here for 10 years, but in the 6 years that I've been airport manager, I've increased our revenues by 106%, from 6.2 million to 12.8 million. An airport that's not busy wouldn't have the opportunity to do that. Also, Cape Air is in its 35th season at the airport. JetBlue is in its 11th season at the airport, and obviously American Airlines just started in their first season, but they're doing so well that their passenger loads have been 80 and 90% full. And that's why they're probably adding additional locations for the airport to fly to. Our users are listed there. I think it's easier for me to show you what those users look like. It's Boston Med Flight that comes in on an annual basis. It's American Airlines. It's our firefighters that some of them have been there. Our longest standing employee has been at the airport for 44 years. 44 years he has supported his family and has been living the aviation dream that he always wanted. And those are things that are important to our community. We have JetBlue employees. We have 4 rental car companies. We have WS Development that's redeveloping the plaza. We have Cape Air, that's the largest commercial commuter airline in the United States. And they're right here, and they started here, and they've been here for 35 years. We have an artist that's in our terminal building, and that's quite unique. And there's oftentimes I will see passengers go and sit in her space, passengers sometimes that are nervous about flying, and they sit there and they get this like relaxing kind of Zen moment, and they just chat with Michelle, and then they go off on their flight. It's really quite unique. So going back to Joint Base Cape Cod, because of all of those users, and because there are ramifications to closing the airport, MEPA certificate said that it was not a viable alternative. FAA said they will not study closure. So just a little bit of background, neither the Airport Commission or the town of Barnstable can close the airport or relocate the airport. They can't just say, this is what we're going to do. That is up to DOT, and that is up to FAA. FAA, again, said they would not study closure. Just some of the impacts associated with that is the airport land, even though we're a town department, the land was given to us by the federal government. The town of Barnstable does not own the land. 639 acres that was deeded to us by the federal government would have to be paid back to the federal government at fair market value in downtown Hyannis. That's an expensive proposition. Additionally, we would have to reimburse the federal government for any of the grants that we've taken to date. That accounts for $99 million of grants. They look at the past 20 years. That's what the grant assurances require us to sign. 99 million and growing. I say growing because we just signed a new grant 2 days ago. Existing airport tenants, they've been, would have to be compensated for their investments. So we have a new tenant that's on the east side of the airport. He spent about $1 million upgrading the building that he's in. He would have to be compensated for that. They would have to be moved to another location and then new facilities constructed for them. So as a department of the town, and only so much money in the airport's financial reserves, the town of Barnstable, when we sign those grant assurances, and because we are a department of the town, the backstop would be with them. They would have to pay back those finances. So it's really something that's quite significant and involved to look at. And for that reason, MEPA and the FAA indicated that that is not an option that they're looking at. Any questions on airport usage?
So, Steve Buckley. So when the FAA said we're not going to look at it, apparently they looked at it enough to not want to study it.
They're not going to study it.
Yeah.
That is a correct
statement.
statement.
So they looked at it close enough. So, and of course, people don't. Yes, bureaucrats write stuff down. So usually they write something down and said, just captured probably, I'm guessing there's an FAA document someplace that covers all the points that you said and said, yeah, we're not going to do this. So they don't do it offhand. It's not like a phone call. Yeah, Bill, we won't have to do that. Yeah, whatever. You know, no, there's a memo someplace.
Yes.
I'm guessing that
Yes.
FAA says that. Okay. So have you seen that memo?
It was a memo that we have provided to Canal Council.
Oh, okay. So it exists. Okay.
Yep.
Just wanted to know because a lot of times you're like, oh, they're not going to do it. It sounds so informal. So thanks.
Yep.
I understand it is more formal than that. Thank you.
Any other questions? To where? Oh, next week. And Stephen, thank you for your comments about our efforts. And I'll just say this because I know this is at the end of the meeting. We're here at 8 o'clock. We want to let you guys go. We have been very diligent in our approach to this. We have a community that surrounds us. And the communities that surround us is part of us. So when we've started doing a number of different types of activities at the airport, we always keep that in mind. When I started this process for the master plan, I said to a different firm, it wasn't Epsilon, Epsilon's doing the environmental review. It was a different firm that did the master plan for us. And when I said to them, I said, we're not going off airport. We're not buying any land for this runway. What can we do to satisfy what our aviation community needs, but also keeping into account what our community's concerns are. And so we came up with a design that looks at using, and this is getting very technical, but uses what we call declared distances. And from the FAA, you're probably very familiar with that. Declared distances allow for the new pavement to be used only in certain directions. So I'm going to have to, don't get sick while I'm doing this. One of the things that we're looking at is declared distances, and this is what was proposed in the master plan and is moving forward in the project for the proposed projects, is this extension right here, 895 feet. That piece of pavement can only be used for takeoff from runway 15. What does that mean? That means that an aircraft can start their run-up right at the end of the runway, and their takeoff roll, where it is today, is not going to be where it is today. Depends on, of course, the weather, the type of aircraft it is. But that aircraft has the ability to use this extra runway for the length that they need, because it's assumed that they'll have they'll have full fuel or near full fuel, being the aircraft that they are. They have more capabilities operationally to use all of that additional length. If an aircraft is landing in that same location, if they're coming from Barnstable Village, they're not using this. They can't use this. This is an area, 895 feet, that they cannot use for landing. There's about, I believe, Bob, it's 400 feet that we're moving the threshold on this end. So there's a difference of only 400 feet. So when that aircraft comes over Barnstable Village and lands there, they're landing essentially in the same location. From an operational standpoint, we tried to minimize what that impact would be for the community by putting in declared distances. The other thing that we did is we had a piece of pavement down here that was also an extension, which would give us more than 895 feet. And based on comments that we received from the town of Yarmouth and their residents, we eliminated that. So this is not affected. The town of Yarmouth is still going to see landings and takeoffs that are in the same location as they are today. This provides our aviation community with that additional length that they need, but it balances that with what we're providing because we're conscious of the community. And we were very purposeful in doing that. Having the additional airport meetings that we've had that go above and beyond what the regulatory requirement is because we have a community that cares about what they live next to, and they have concerns. And so we provided more opportunity for that correspondence and those communications as part of this process and as part of the master plan process. We also are doing an additional study to look at departure procedures because we've heard from our community that they have concerns about that. So I maybe shouldn't take it personally, but I do, because I care about what happens at this airport. You talk about Joint Base Cape Cod. Joint Base Cape Cod's runways are the same length as Logan Airport. Cape Cod was not built to be Logan. That's not what this community is. We are constrained, and that's a good thing, because we're only going to get as big as we can. And I think that's an appropriate size airport for this area. If folks want to go to internationally, fly internationally, and they can't do a direct flight from Hyannis, guess what? They're either going to stop in another city and understand that, or they're going to go up to Boston and take their flight. That's the reality of it. You know, we're not going to build something just because we think people will come. We have to build for what we need, and right now, even our existing aircraft need longer runway length. Even the new JetBlue aircraft that's coming in does not need the same length that our existing general aviation aircraft need. They are the ones that need the longer length, and they're already here. We also took a better approach at looking at the runway extension, and the reason why we eliminated the 3-3 approach end extension was because we looked at stage lengths, and we said, is anybody really going to fly from here nonstop to California? What is the likelihood? Well, most of the people that are flying into Cape Cod Gateway Airport are coming from Connecticut, New York, DC, their stage lengths are, what's appropriate is really, I get so many people asking me to provide flights down to Florida. Well, a flight from here to Florida, the stage length is about 1,500 nautical miles. We looked at the existing aircraft in our fleet, plus the new proposed JetBlue aircraft, to say, can you conceivably get nonstop 1,500 nautical miles to a Florida destination? Yes, you can, and you can do that with the 895 feet additional length that's being added. So we just tried to put some reality to it, because we know we live in a community. And we also provide other aspects of our airport and open our airport to the community. We have aviation internships. We have one of our interns from Barnstable High School is on the cover of on the cover of Bridgewater State University's magazine last month, because she went through the program. She came to the airport to get more information. She was here with us for a whole semester. She got the bug, and now she's going to school for aviation. It's about our community too. So I'll leave you with that. I don't know if anybody has any more comments, but very conscious of time. I went 10 minutes over. If anybody has any additional questions, let us know. Okay, well, thank you very much.